Welcome to our live event today. We are going to be working on a fun little project that kind of falls into a series. If you've been following along or if you're new, welcome to our Facebook Live of National Quilter Circle. We're going to work on a project that doesn't take a lot of time, but is a really good skill builder in a variety of ways. It has to do with triangles and getting our piecing down, but we're going to talk about color today too. So we're going to add in a new facet to our planning of our project. So if you're if you haven't gone in and downloaded the pattern, it's available in the link that you see in the chat section for Radiant Ruby. So we're quickly falling into February. It's still January, but we want to have enough time to maybe work on something that's kind of Valentine-like. So that Ruby project link is found in the chat. Remember that you are welcome to, at any point, if I talk about something and you're like, oh, I missed that, and you want me to go into a little more depth, put in the chat. Just simply pop in there and give me some keywords like cover this, or I didn't catch that. Can you talk about that tool a little more? So that I make sure that I have clarity with you. The whole idea of us coming together as a community is to learn from each other and have a little fun, a little break from maybe the monotony of our day, or just a creative break, and maybe come up with a new technique, a new idea, a new inspiration. And also let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to go in after the show. And if you've been following along, I do go in after the show and I talk with everybody who makes a comment. So let us know where you're from and maybe what you're working on, maybe for Valentine's, or if you've attempted any of the gemstone table toppers that we're creating here in our National Quilter Circle community. So make sure that you do all those. We got our housekeeping done. I'm sporting a little Iowa State today because I'm from the state of Iowa. I went to Iowa State, and we have a basketball game tonight. We have a really important player playing on the 49ers that no one expected maybe to be a really great football player in the NFL. So I'm sporting a 49er support of an alumni to Iowa State today. You don't usually see me wearing too many logo shirts, but that's my team. Okay, so if we've got the pattern downloaded, or if you don't, grab something to take some notes with as we go along today. And we're going to go into a little bit more about color selection and trying to create a variation, because red can be kind of a tough one to decide which direction to go. But if you have been watching, we originally started with emerald eyes quite a while ago. And I created this one with some green fabrics that I absolutely loved. And my hometown school colors were green and white. And I happened to be Irish. So, of course, emerald eyes was created just with the intent of making one of these. But I use a computer program that helps me design and lets me plunk colors in and out, twist triangles around, and create all these fun designs. And I came up with more than one layout, and I was like, do I want to waste all those? So after the next one came along, I also love the color blue. My dad's favorite color was blue. So Sapphire Shimmer came along next. And those extra layouts that I had created, those other designs, were coming to life in other colors. And after I had named something emerald and sapphire, then someone said, are you going to do all the jewel tones? So that gave me another inspiration. Why not do a series and see where we can play with lights and darks and mediums to create dimension and really fun designs? So that's where sapphire came from. And then it was like, what color is next? Well, yellow isn't always my favorite color, but a little bit of yellow goes a long way. So in the topaz creation of treasure, this yellow, I use a little yellow. It makes a really great reflection in quilts. It pairs up with other colors, but it was a challenge for me because it wasn't a color palette that I use a lot. So by doing something small, we can sometimes challenge ourselves to create that, or to work with colors that maybe aren't our go-to color every time. And to create that variation in shades and lights and darks is always a good thing for us to practice. So Topaz Treasure came along, And then, of course, we have to do something with rubies. Radiant Ruby was the next one that I've got. I've got others slated, so you'll have to kind of follow along and look for the gemstones as they pop along. But this one is Radiant Ruby. And when I went to pick out reds, that's where it came into play of what direction do I go? Because with red, if most of these colors, if you add white to them or a lighter, you get lighter shades. Like in a darker blue, you add white, you get light blue and a lighter blue and a pattern blue. But when you add white to red, what do you get but pink? That's actually has always been one of my favorite colors. So do I go towards pink or do I go another direction? So that was the challenge, standing in the quilt shop with an array of red fabrics in front of me, trying to figure out what direction to go. Now, the ultimate dig is to go to your stash and say, I want to try and create this out of my stash, because it doesn't take a lot of fabric to do these. And you can see that evidently I like red. My college colors were red and cardinal and gold, so in the red family. And you can see that I've collected a lot of small pieces of red fabrics over the years. And I thought about trying to do it out of this, but then I thought, do I want to go towards the pink, or do I want to challenge myself to try and go into somehow making it lighter and lighter without adding pink? So here is some of the ones that I ended up kicking back out because I didn't know for sure if I wanted to go that direction. I wanted to challenge myself to do something different. Okay, so when you start to pick fabrics, you know right away whether or not you are a person who likes stripes. Stripes make a challenge because stripes, when cut from triangle squares, are going to do some wonky things, and lines are going to go in different directions. So if that really is going to bother you, stay away from stripes. If you are a person who doesn't mind the design getting a little bit of emotion going on in a design, and you don't mind stripes, then you can go that direction. Or if you want a very subtle stripe. This is a very, very small, close red and white stripe. It's almost like a pinstripe. It's really, really narrow. So it would be a very subtle motion to it. This one, on the other hand, very wild, very vibrant, would really show up in the design. So if those wiggly lines going in odd directions is going to bother you, okay, make that choice. When it comes to getting lighter, in order to get darks, mediums, and lights, because all of these projects really force you to start thinking about the values, and your cell phone can be your best assistant at this, is to take your phone. If you think you have the gradient of light and medium and dark figured out, to make sure that you're going to get that definition between pieces. So take your phone, take a picture, and then go into the edit portion where you can take it into black and white. Because by doing it as black and white photo, you will quickly notice whether or not your mediums may also read as darks. Because sometimes we pick things and we think, okay, that's going to be a medium. It's got some light in it. But when you photograph it and look, it reads very dark. So you're not going to get, if I were to put these two, maybe these two next to each other, a solid and a pin dot, they don't have much definition between them. So I'm not going to get a really distinct design. It also makes a difference whether or not you want it to be very subtle or if you want a sharp contrast. So know ahead, okay, I want this one to have sharp contrast. So I need to really make the difference between my light, my medium, and my dark. Because otherwise we get kind of this mushy, kind of soft gradient of colors, okay? So when I was playing with these, I thought, well, if I want to go into something that's light, but not pink, I would have to use something like these. Maybe a check or a print that has mostly white background, or in this case, an even red and white. This would be the step between these two. And I've done other quilts with those on them. So I decided, you know what, instead of going towards that white or that really light background, which I have done on my other samples, I decided to go into the pink range. So when you wander off into pink, I chose that ruby red, a dark, dark red. It's almost a brick red, I guess, maybe, but we'll call it ruby for now. I decided to then find instead of going to maybe say a dot like lighter, true, but yet I wanted to go toward pink. So as I was searching, I found a red that actually had a pink tone in it. It's a red on red, so we're not introducing white here. I've got the deep dark tone in there. I've got that pink color in it. So I'm stepping in the right direction. So then I wanted to pick up the pinkish tone in that. And if you're in a shop that has a really wide array of colors, I was lucky enough to find this that's a pink, but it has some really deep values in it that are similar to the flecks of pink in this piece. And then in order to get a really light, I actually got lucky by going to Art Gallery Fabrics. That this one had kind of a blush color, which is really popular among young people right now, that blush tone. I think my daughter, our future daughter-in-law, would almost choose that as the color for her bridesmaids' dresses, in that kind of boho, kind of a light mauve almost. It has a gray tone to it, but it reads as a good light with these as kind of our media. This is the lightest. I would call this a light medium. And then the medium and the dark. So in the pattern, trying to remember how did I put it. Okay, I call this my light pink, the lightest one. I did call this pink. And then I called this red because it's in that medium one. And then the dark red, I guess, is that how I actually labeled those things in the pattern so that it's easy to identify by just looking. This is the lightest, this is the darkest, and the steps in between. So we're using 4 fabrics for this one. So now that we've thought about what direction we want to go with red and going into the pink this time, instead of always using a white as the background here, that blush color just kind of gives you a soft place to land your eye. It's not as stark as a bright white, and it just kind of lets the colors float from one place to the next. So this one probably has almost more pink in it than red, but as we look at it, the chevron shapes here kind of give you a fashion of a heart. So it to me, it can be kind of a subtle Valentine table topper and not have to be specifically applique hearts or something that's really round. It's kind of a modern heart shape. Okay, what do we've got here? We've got people from Florida. Good morning, Sandra from Florida. I love it. Oh, we have Bridget from France. Chilly in France this morning. It's chilly in Iowa too. I think if we get out of the single digits, we're going to be doing good. That's why the sweater. It's a little bit cold in Iowa. We've got someone from New Mexico. That's fabulous. So think about our community reaches around the globe. And that's the fun of coming together as with our Facebook Live events. So remember, if you have any questions, pop in. We've got somebody from Ontario. Our Canadian quilters are here, and they know about gold. That's for sure. Okay, Radiant Ruby. Let's talk about the cutting and the planning for putting this one together. Get these out of the way so I can get to my sewing machine. Make sure I get my iron to its temperature. Wonderful that irons nowadays shut off after a certain length of time so we don't damage them or burn down our house, but sometimes they go off. We quilters, we like our irons to be on the whole time we're quilting. Okay, from your pattern, it's going to ask you, it's going to actually denote all of the 4 colors and then tell you that you need so much binding. I usually put the binding separate because sometimes people want to pick a different color, maybe not the darkest red like I've used here. So you can pick any of those colors and tag along a 1/4 yard for that binding. And I will give you the amount for your backing. People always like to know what in the world do you put on the back of your quilts? Sometimes I match and sometimes I just go a little rogue. And I found this pink and red floral that I thought was so fun with this one. So if I really wanted to flip it over, I would have a completely different quilt and the binding still read well with the floral there. So sometimes you want a 2-for-1 when you put a fabric on the back. So I did a fun floral as the back of this quilt. And your supplies, of course, your rotary cutter, cutting mat, a square ruler, a Tucker trimmer I talk about, but you can simply use a square ruler also for the trimming portion. And I forgot to pull it out. So the Tucker trimmer will help us later as we trim our blocks down, because we're going to use a method for making multiple pieces at once to try to reduce the amount of error in our cutting. Because if we can cut 2 squares, put them together, and make 8 triangle squares at one time, think about the reduced amount of error that happens there. It's great, but they are just a little bit oversized, so they do need to be trimmed. It's not a lot of wasted fabric in the trimming. And some people have experienced that recently in a project, and they're like, I am done trimming triangles, and I don't want to do that anymore. Okay, I will accommodate you in that method. So when you go into your pattern, I got to find the page. I think it's page 4 of your pattern. I don't have it right in front of me. There is a chart for making 8 at a time and 2 at a time triangle squares. If you don't want to trim, there is a column that you can alter that size just a tiny bit, and they will come out the exact size. Okay, so for those of you who hate trimming, I understand. So just go to that chart, and then you have that chart for other projects also, because I don't just put one size there, I put multiple sizes. So if trimming's not in your wheelhouse, size your block just according to that chart, and you will have exact sizes when you're done cutting apart in the 8 at a time or the 2 at a time. Okay, so accommodate everybody. Okay, Sandra says, you're always so interesting, enlightening, and I always look forward to you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I like to bring projects to quilters, even if you're a seasoned quilter or a new quilter, something that's accomplishable. You can sharpen your skills, gain some knowledge, and have some fun. It's a break from all the rest of the things going on in your life, and we get to come together and have some fun and learn something. Okay. Oh, my outfit coordinates with my project. I really didn't think of that ahead of time. It just happened. So I guess go state. Okay, let's work on how to read this pattern, because when I write these anymore, I create my design in a program, and then I go back and code all of the combinations so that the 2 colors that come together have a certain alphabet letter, and how I go about that process. So when you go into your cutting, it's going to tell you if you're doing the trimming version. For those who don't want to trim, plug your ears. The trimming version, you're going to use 4-inch squares and 8-inch squares. And it's going to tell you of each of the colors how many of those squares to cut. Simple square cutting, no triangles here. There is also in there one other cut of square. If you look at the design here, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 3.5-inch squares of just the pink fabric. Make sure you cut those and set those aside, and they are marked as a letter G. Do not forget them, because you start putting your triangle squares together and you're going to have holes in your design. You're going to go, oh, she told me to hold on to those 4 squares because they're already exact size. So don't forget about them, because why do I know this? Maybe I did that and went, oh, did I cut those? Yes, I did. So those 4 are absolute just perfect squares. The rest you're going to be making larger and making multiples at a time. Okay, in the chart for how to do the construction, I've got a couple of examples here. Let me take the sample. We'll put it on my chair so that's an easy grab if we need it for reference. Okay, now, in order to make the multiples that we need, the most efficient way for me to present it to you was to create a checklist. So if you go to the construction, if you've already downloaded, if you have not, just imagine in your head, you're going to find a checklist in the pattern, and it's going to tell you to at first make 8-inch squares paired up. The first example is the pink and the dark red. So we've got pink, dark red, 8-inch square, and you're going to make 8 at a time. But it says 2 sets. So do this twice. And then you're going to label those all letter A. And then you're going to put them in a Ziploc bag, Post-it note, whatever you need to do to keep track of letter A. Then you're going to go down to the next one, and it says to make 2 sets of that color combination. So it's kind of a checklist that you can work on a little at a time in case you are a person who works during the day and you only have maybe a few minutes each evening to work on a project. That actually is a checklist. I put a little mark in front so you can check it off. Say, okay, I did those 2. Check it off. Now you know where to start when you come back the next time around. What we're going to be doing, and there's a diagram that tells you how to do 2 at a time, or 8 at a time, I'm sorry, triangle squares. So if this is a new technique for you, follow along. If this is something you've done multiple times, wonderful. You've got this technique figured out, and you'll probably be able to jump right in to work on this project. Now, in order to mark across this project, you can use just a simple ruler and mark across a diagonal, or you can use tools like a 1/4-inch seam marker or quick quarter. They come in different sizes. Yes, probably you've acquired maybe the short version of these, but they also come in a longer version that will stretch all the way across the project. These are great if you want guidelines for where to actually do the stitching and the cutting, because these tools, I'll do the blue one, it's a little easier to see across the fabric. It goes corner to corner across the fabric. I have to line it up. There we go. You can mark down through the center so you have a cutting line, and then on each side of this will be your stitching line. So if you kind of need training wheels because you're not so confident of where a 1/4-inch seam would be off of a center mark, then you can go ahead and mark the stitching line on each side of this tool. So it will be an exact 1/4-inch for you. And make sure that you use a fabric marking pen of some sort. I'm using a friction pen. This is on the back side of the fabric. Friction pens can leave ghost lines, which means that if I iron over this, later it can leave kind of a white, chalky looking line behind. But if I'm using it on the back side of the fabric, no one would ever see that line. Okay, and then down the center, if you want that marking for cutting later, it has slots in it for that cutting line. So it would look like this. If you are a confident quilter of what your 1/4-inch seam looks like and where you need to stitch from, just take a simple ruler, go corner to corner across the block, draw one line, and then stitch on each side of that line. Okay, let's see if we've got any other comments here. Nothing yet. Make sure you put your pieces right side together. Match up on the outside corners. If you are at all worried about your fabrics not having enough body to them, maybe you are a person who washes your fabrics before and has taken all the sizing out, you can use a little bit of spray starch on your fabric before you cut out your squares. Doing the spray starch before you cut gives the fabric a little body so that it's easier to manipulate in the machine, and you don't get a stretch or a distortion later in the pressing process. So let's see where we're at. Okay, I've got this pinned. I used to always pin kind of across where I'm going to be stitching, but in order to not have to take out pins in the stitching process, I've kind of put them out in no man's land along the straight sides of this block. We're gonna stitch across the block twice. Remember those stitching lines we marked with either the quick quarter, or you're gonna stitch on either side of the center mark. So depending on which you choose, and my instructions will show you exactly where those stitching lines need to fall and where the cutting needs to be. We are trying to make sure that we can teach really really good skills to those who are beginners and maybe those who haven't used this technique before. I'm not sure who invented this little fast technique originally, but I wish it was me because it is so slick. Being able to make multiple triangle squares without having to do a lot of cutting of triangles or a lot of small squares. It was an ingenious creation and has probably saved quilters hundreds of hours of piecing small triangles together or two at a time triangle squares. So kudos to the person who created this fun technique. Well, the first time I saw it, I thought, oh, really? Why didn't I have that like 5 years ago? It would have been so fast, especially if you're creating matching pairs of things, multiples. This is the technique to really hone in and get figured out. Okay, so by going across twice, I'll show you where I stitched. I take my pins out so it'll be ready to be cut and pressed. Oops, get the pin in the right direction. Okay, little messy on the edges, but I think you can see my stitching lines there. Here you can see the stitching lines. The ones with the black marking pen are a little bit brighter, but you can see that it's like a railroad track gone across the square both directions. Okay, so then I'm going to need this for cutting. Slide our pattern out of the way for now. We are going to press this first because whenever you stitch a diagonal across a fabric, you're going to get a little bit of a warping going on. You want it nice and flat when you're taking it to the cutting step next. So I'm pressing. I'm just letting the iron do the work. People ask about irons all the time, and I usually say the heaviest iron that you can handle because the weight of the iron actually does the work for you. So I know that lightweight irons are out there, but I tend to go with a little bit heavier iron. Just let the iron do the work instead of my shoulder. Okay, now that I have this pressed, I'm going to do a cutting process, and it's more than just down between the lines. We are actually going to cut 4 times. And so in your instructions, the diagrams will show you where the cutting is going to happen. This is an 8-inch square. So half of 8 is 4. So when I put the 4-inch line, and if you need a little backup, you can use a Post-it note, something to remind you of where that 4-inch line is so you don't make a mistake, because this is going to be 8 triangle squares at a time. We don't want to make a cut in the wrong place. So you can put a piece of glow line tape. You can use Post-it notes, something for your eye to know. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the 4-inch line. It's going to go along one edge of my 8-inch square. Hopefully, if my piecing and stitching has been correct, the edge of my ruler should fall right through the X's of my stitching. And we're going to cut up through there. Now, I'm going to do the same thing from the bottom up. So lining that up on the bottom of my 8-inch square, 4 inches, and make a cut across. Now, if I would have remembered to bring my rotating mat downstairs, I left it upstairs. I'm going to actually move this so that I can do my next 2 cuts. If I had my rotating mat or if I had a smaller mat on my table, I would just rotate the entire mat, because we always want to work cutting away from ourselves, never toward ourselves. I am not a nurse. I don't do well with blood, and I do not like accidents. We need to keep all of our digits intact. Okay, the next cut we're going to do is down between the stitching lines. This is where you want to have the best grip on your ruler because you don't want to veer off and nick into your stitching line. If you get close but don't go through it, it's okay. It'll be fine. But try to go right down between the stitching lines. And then this direction so that I'm down through the middle. And voila, I will have 8 matching triangle squares of those fabric combinations, which we use in Radiant Ruby. So when it comes to the pressing, You can press them one at a time if you like. This is how I work in my sewing room upstairs while I'm creating designs, is that I take my iron, I start on the very first one up a ways on my mat or my cutting or my pressing surface, and open it up and press toward the darker fabric. Let the iron do the work, pick up the next, lay it on top, and my iron cooled down in between. Lovely. But anyway, you get the idea. We're laying one on top of the other, letting the heat from the ironing board help us out. Those wool pressing mats are wonderful if you have one. But if you don't, just letting the ironing, there it goes. Ironing board kind of absorbs some of the heat and helps press from both sides here also. So go on to do all of the half square triangles 8 at a time method that are in the checklist in the pattern. Make sure that's hot. Okay, so then you'll have 8 of, you'll have 16 of those because you have to do the process twice. Go down through a checklist. Once you've accomplished all of the 8-inch squares, it does tell you then to go do the 2 at a time process. So that you don't create a lot of leftover extras, I tried to be very specific. Once in a while, you might have a couple extras, but this process, if when I was totaling them up and you needed actually 10 of something, okay, do the 8 at a time process, then come in and do a 2 at a time so that you don't waste fabric, okay? Now this one, I'm just going to do a simple mark across so that I'm going to stitch on each side of this one. Put my little line on there, right sides together with my fabric, going down again through the checklist. What color combination do I need first? I need the pink and the red. So that sparkly little square piece, that's the red that we're using in this one. So that was the first combination I needed. Then to stitch down on each side of my line. Once you kind of get used to where a 1/4 inch seam is, you can then use just one marking line, which takes a little less time to mark everything, but is efficient. So I'm going to stitch on each side of that diagonal line on my 4-inch squares and do the same kind of process, but we're only going to be making 2 now. This is the little bit simpler stitching and pressing. So I've got now 2 pieces there that I'm creating. Again, always take the time to do the pressing. Pressing is really part of the process, and try not to skip that because you can get a lot of distorted pieces if you don't take the time on that to do the pressing. Now, you can use a rotary cutter, or you know what, we're still on scissors. You can actually use a scissors just to cut down between the stitching line. If the 1/4 inch seam isn't exactly perfect, it's okay. It's going to be on the inside of your quilt project. Then go in and press seam allowances, usually toward the darker, but there are times in this process where I will do what I call a correction. As I lay my quilt out, if I decide that it would lay flatter in a row, if one of the seam allowances flip the other direction, I will actually go in and do a correction. So this is how I would do it. Say I've got this lined up and I want to put 2 pieces together, but when they come together, I won't have opposing seams, and I'm going to have a really hard time making those pieces ride over the top of each other. What you can do is take your little triangle square to the iron, press it back flat. It's going to take a little bit of heat, but press it back flat. Lay this, like close back up like this, and then flip the seam the other direction. It can happen. It's not the end of the world that you pressed it all to the dark. You can flip to have seam allowances that oppose when you're joining pieces together in a row. And voila, he's flipped the other direction, so that now if I were to put these 2 pieces together, I would have opposing seams and I will get a nice intersection of pieces. So it's not against the rules to go in and do some corrective pressing, is what I call it. I love it when seams butt up against each other so I get nice intersections. Okay, do remember, it does tell you in your pattern, and I think I even put it in bold print because it can get missed. Trim, now this is if you're in the trim group, number 5 says trim all half square triangles to 3.5 inches. So don't try to put it together without trimming. Your project will be a little bit bigger, number 1. It may not be quite as exact because in the stitching, in the pressing, in the cutting, we can have some issues, okay? So the triangle trimmer, which is our Tucker trimmer, I'm sorry, is this is the one that has it on the even inch or the half inch. There are other Tucker trimmers out there that trim on the 1/4 and the 3/4 inch. This, I think, now is labeled as the Tucker trimmer 1. I have the old version. So they invented or created more in the series. So they had to go back and call the first one number 1. Okay. Michelle asks, can you use a heat press to press the squares? You could, but you don't have quite as much control because a heat press, I believe, my sister-in-laws use a heat press when they do screen print or putting iron-ons onto things. And I believe you have to have it in place and then you clamp down and you may lose control of the pieces. You could try it, but with the iron, you have really direct control with the nose of the iron. It's a little smaller. It's easier to really make sure that things stay in place as the iron is set onto it. But try it, see if it works for you. But I'm not sure if you'll have as much control as you really want in that process. But if that's the only thing you have available to you, try it. Go for it. Campbell asks, she printed the pattern and precise instructions. I try to use as few words as possible, but don't leave you off in the ditch someplace because I don't like patterns that are that way, but I don't like them to be overly wordy either. Tell me what I need to know, what piece I need to pick up, and just give me the straight out instructions, not too much in between. So I'm glad that you find them helpful. Okay, Tucker trimmer. You can also use just a regular square ruler, anything that you can find the 3.5 mark on. But on the Tucker trimmer, since I'm trying to get to 3.5, I'm using the place on the ruler. Let me show you really quick. Where am I on time? No, we're not doing too bad. On this one, the square here, or the corner has a circle dot that's complete. That will finish. If you put that in the top right corner, you're cutting for the even inch. If you use this corner in the top right corner, it has half a circle. It finishes on the 1/2 inch. How practical was she when she created these? Deb Tucker is ingenious. So I've seen her in person. She is very energetic and she creates great tools. We are going to put the diagonal line on top of the diagonal seam of our triangles. And we are looking for the 3.5 inch line so we can trim just a tiny bit off the top and side. So you can trim 2 sides there. And then you have this little tiny waist. See, I'm not wasting fabric. I hate throwing a lot of fabric in the wastebasket, but if I can trim just a tiny bit, turn my block, trim the other 2 sides. Again, this takes off the dog ears, the little triangles on the corners. Just a little bit left for the wastebasket, and then I have a perfect half square triangle. Do that on all your pieces before you start laying them out. So you have them all, the A's together, the B's together, the C's together. And don't forget square number G. He's hanging out. You've already cut him in the early cutting portion. Make sure you have him ready to go for the layout. Now, let's clean up here really quick, and we can talk about our finished project. All of the ABCs are also listed in the pattern diagram. I put in a color-coded, and then there are ABCs on there so you know exactly where everything goes. But do exactly this. Take a picture with your phone to make sure that you have everything turned properly. Why do I know this also? I laid this guy out, and I thought I had everything right, but I caught it before I sewed it together. it's very easy to have the right unit, but maybe not oriented correctly. So by taking a picture with your phone, it gives you the long view. You can then look back to make sure that everything is oriented the right direction, because it's all about twist and turn on triangle squares. So once you get these laid out, then you're putting your rows together. And as I'm putting those rows together, if I find that an opposing seam would be helpful at some point, I will do that corrective press by flipping the seam a different direction. And then the seams that join units together, I suggest all even going one way, all odd rows going the other, so that as you join rows, you get, again, opposing seams. Anything to make things more fluid and simpler is the ticket here. Okay, quick on the quilting. I decided to do a little bit of curves on this one. Let's see if I can hold it to the light. You can see curves in this block here and in this section here. I am working on doing curves on the domestic machine. I can do curves on my long arm, but on the domestic machine, it was a little bit trickier. So I actually did go in with a template and drew with a fabric marking pen that would erase, not a friction pen. I was using one of the water-soluble blue pens that then I could give myself guidelines. If you aren't perfectly on the guideline, it's okay. Leave it in. Later, you won't even probably notice that you maybe wobbled off of the blue line a little bit. It just creates a shadow, a dimension to your project, so that you practice those skills. Because these small projects are a lot easier to practice on the domestic machine, to maneuver under there, to get the skills, to help your mind get used to making the curve fluid. So this is a really great place to practice. I did some other really simple outlining stitches on the chevrons. I did a lot of in the ditch work, which everybody can default to. I did some micro stippling on the lightest pink here. I wanted that to just recede, to pull back and just kind of be a background and not be allowed. So I found a very light thread that would match and kind of pull that into the background. So have a little fun when you do your quilting. This is the place to play. These small projects are great for practice. Radiant Ruby was our project today. I'm glad that you joined me. We talked about color, depth. Do we want to do something with maybe a white background with a little bit more color, making go from light to dark? Or do we want to add that going into the pink variation of what red is when you add white to it? So remember all of the links for all of the other options for Emerald Eyes, Sapphire Shimmer, Topaz Treasure, and Radiant Ruby in the chat box. So I'm glad that you joined me today. I'll be back in 2 weeks with a project here. Be looking for other projects coming along. There is a Valentine project going, a package deal that I will be part of a format tomorrow. So if you're looking for something to do, some ideas for Valentine's Day, join us tomorrow. Thanks for joining me.